Hey everybody, welcome to High Spirits. It's episode 57, and as always, I'm joined today by AnnaRae Grabstein.
Hi guys.
I'm gonna get this music thing right one time. It automatically goes to loop. This is not cool. We got to fix that StreamYard. Anyways, we are recording Thursday, August 29th, and we have an incredible show for you today. We have one of the most prolific writers in the cannabis space. He's covered the industry for well over a decade now, and everything from finance, everything across North America, South America, and beyond. Javier Hasse, but we will get there soon. AnnaRae, how's your week going?
I'm having a great week. I've been coordinating a bunch of different cannabis events that I'm participating in the next couple of months. It feels like conference season is coming up, and I'm excited to get out of the weeds and off Zoom and in person with some friends. Hall of Flowers, Benzinga, 𝗵𝗵𝐿. It's all coming. And
conference season is coming in hot.
Yeah, it's coming in hot. So I'm excited for that. It's fun to get to feel like we're all part of the community when we get together. Not just solving hard problems and spreadsheets. So
that is true. That is true. But I've enjoyed taking a couple months off of like the heavy travel schedule. Like the summer's been kind of nice, spend at home with the family. But yeah,
absolutely. It's a balance, right?
Got some planning to do. Got some flights to book. I'm gonna like in this new season, I'm going to try to stop waiting to the very last minute to book flights, because I have noticed that there's less options these days, and I like having options when I book my flights.
There you go. And we're going to be planning a High Spirits event in Vegas in December. So stay tuned.
Right.
Reach out to us if you want to be there, be a part of it. But yeah, things are good. It's been an interesting time where there's still tremendous challenges in cannabis, but there's also little pockets of momentum, and I keep kind of wandering into them, and that's been nice. It's fun. I helped a group get a Minnesota application in a couple weeks back, and there's a lottery come in Minnesota, and the Maryland lottery that happened is bringing a bunch of new companies to kind of startup phase where they're going to be opening and launching. New Jersey continues to have new businesses that are launching like every single week. We're going to be talking with one next week, actually. So yeah, I'm feeling like there's lots of places to have fun, lots of problems to be solved all the time.
Absolutely. Well, I live most of my cannabis life in the beverage category, and momentum is what you can describe our category with. So very grateful for that. As we kind of approach November, a lot of excitement just around the not just the presidential race, but how that's influencing the Senate and the House races. I was seeing an article this morning just about the 10 Senate races that could potentially flip the Senate. It would take a wave of sorts in order to do so. But just thinking about how that could change the trajectory of the legalization effort in that conversation. So
yeah,
on the edge of my seat until November.
Yeah, in general, if any party ends up winning the House and the Senate and the president seat, like there's an opportunity for a lot more policy movement, and I think that
more,
could be
more so than the last time it happened, because it did happen. It just we did not use it well.
Yeah, totally. Well, should we bring on our guest and just jump in?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I'm excited to introduce Javier. He is a seasoned reporter with over a decade of experience focused on cannabis, hemp, CBD, psychedelics. He's been writing for Forbes for over 5 years, and he currently serves as the head of content and managing director at Benzinga and CEO of the Spanish language news site El Planteo, which he founded. He he has work that's appeared in all kinds of outlets that you have all read and seen, like CNN and Rolling Stone and Playboy and the Chicago Tribune and more. He has written his first book, which is Start Your Own Cannabis Business, and it's a bestseller. And he's got another book that's coming out in 2024, which we'll let him tell us about. He's been named as one of High Time's most 100 influential people in cannabis, and there is just so much more to say about him, and we'll let him share more about himself. Welcome, Javier.
Oh, look at it. He's blushing.
Well, thank you. I honestly, I'm done. Wait, let's talk about something else. Let's cannabis. How you doing?
Doing all right, man. So thank you so much for joining us after that long list that AnnaRae rattled off. I don't know how you have the time. Like, I'm just trying to, like, I'm white knuckling running one business. And I know how busy things are at Benzinga alone, but El Planteo, which maybe a lot of us English speakers don't know the breadth of it. It's the most read or most read publication in the Spanish speaking cannabis world.
It is. It's pretty impressive feat, I think. A credit to the entire team there. We got about 25 people working on it, and it's kind of my baby, along with my co-founders Natalia and Cynthia. But it's something that we love doing. I loved what you mentioned in your intro, right? Like, what defines cannabis is edge over seats, problem solving, and momentum, right? Like the three things that you mentioned that were, very determinant to the cannabis space.
Well, I want to hear more about El Planteo because I think that might be new for a lot of our listeners, which tend to be U.S. based on our data that we review. But tell us about what you're doing there and your journey to starting it as the CEO and founder with your partners.
Well, it's interesting, right? I gotta deliver a keynote speech tomorrow at an event called Media Party, right? And it's something that they do in New York and in Buenos Aires in Argentina, where I'm based. And I was thinking a little bit about the genesis and how it came to be, right? And I think we identified this gap in Spanish language content around cannabis, right? For many years, all we had were publications that spoke to the home grower, that spoke to the extreme cannabis enthusiast, right? And when I get together with my friends, we smoke a joint, but we don't want to talk about weed all the time. We want to talk about a bunch of other things: music, politics, cinema, whatever, philosophy, right? And so we wanted to create a media outlet in El Planteo that spoke to that audience of cannabis consumers who are interested in a bunch of other stuff, not just how to grow it, the secrets or the best strains, but also, its medical benefits, also music, also culture, gender issues. So whatever, whatever kind of conversation you would have when you're high or you're stoned, whether you love video games or you love movies. And we also, I think we accompanied this process that has been global of the rebranding from marijuana, the devil's lettuce, to cannabis, right? And the most successful rebranding I've seen in my life. It's amazing, right? And in my personal journey, I've experienced this when I started writing in 2013 about cannabis. My parents were like, "Oh, you're going to mess up your career. Oh, my son works with medical marijuana. It's not the same as the thing that druggies do." And as the rebranding from marijuana to cannabis, really took off and took on in society, they started to accept it. And El Planteo was born from the desire to accompany that movement, that shift in perceptions, right? And in doing so, we managed to permeate the mainstream, right? We have our content is on MSN and Microsoft News every day, of course, on Google News and Flipboard, and it shows up on Benzinga, and it's showing up on Yahoo Finance and the Spanish section of High Times, with full of our content. And it's I think it's been an interesting journey for sure. Not one that I personally thought of, really. Just some partners came up to me a few years ago and said, "Hey, we want you to do what you did at Benzinga in Spanish." And I was like, I don't know. I've never been a CEO before.
Yeah.
What do I need to do? And they were like, just do it.
Just do it.
You'll figure it out. And it's a learning process. I don't know what your experiences in leadership have been, and if it was gradual or one day you were kind of pushed to a position that was like way above what you'd done before.
Well, it's funny, I've worked with a lot of early stage startups, a lot of times coming from the idea stage and outside of the cannabis industry, and oftentimes it'd be like, oh, it's a chef that loves to prepare meals, and he or she wants to launch a food service delivery company, and the first day you have to tell them, it's like, you do know your life is going to be anything but cooking, right? And he's like, it could be built around the concept of what you love, and that has to drive you, but you're going to be doing all the different things, and largely people management is what it comes down to. And so, yeah, absolutely different. So you talked about the rebranding, and this is just a quick left turn, because there's been this kind of, I feel like the rebrand within the industry has been executed, and it's like everyone calls it cannabis, and now there's these alternative threads starting where it's like, oh, people are trying to bring back marijuana in a multitude of different ways.
Mm-hmm.
The one thread I've been seeing is that it's not racially charged, and in fact it's whitewashing to call it cannabis, because it actually comes, it's been called marijuana for millennia, and it wasn't something that was created by the government. Doesn't mean you can't apply a stigma to an existing word. Also, I've seen it on the other side is, the hemp industry trying to pigeonhole the regulated cannabis market into marijuana and saying cannabis is the umbrella that covers hemp and marijuana, which I guess technically it does. So as someone who has a foot in the mainstream through your writing with Forbes and books and whatnot, what do we need to be saying to each other to make sure that we're doing ourselves a favor and benefiting from the rebrand that we fought so hard to achieve?
It's a complex question, I think, right? Like, words might have different meanings depending on the context, on who says them, right? I get that many times. People in America will tell me, you can't say marijuana. It's like, why not? It's my word, right? Like,
yeah, I'm Argentinian.
Yeah, why? There's no racial charge in when I'm saying it, but at the same time, I understand the need for that rebranding, right? The beyond the racial aspect of it, there has been a stigma, social stigma associated to the word marijuana, right? And it's seen as a drug, the whole gateway drug theory. But I think they're interchangeable in many contexts. I also like weed, I like pot, I like herb. Also, what I'm writing, right? I can't say cannabis a million times in a story. I try to switch it up, but I don't think there's a definitive answer. I read an op-ed last year from a Latina writer as well. I'm going to try and remember the media outlet it was published on, but she broke down why marijuana was not a racially charged word. And she went through the history, and I thought it was very enlightening, right? It surprised me. I had bought that narrative of the discrimination and the racial charge behind the word, and it seems like the actual historical evidence does not support that theory, right?
What about in Spanish? Like when you're writing about marijuana and cannabis, are there that many words to use? And how do you?
Yes. Oh, millions, and it varies from country to country, right? Like, and you'll have different dialects, right? So think of Latin America as the European Union, right? Like there's a bunch of countries, but then the differences in the language is like U.S. English and British English and South African English, for instance, right? Or Australian English. So we'll have different words. Many of them are common, but many of them are not. Like in Mexico, they will say mota, but porro is not as common. In Argentina, porro is super common, same as in Spain. But in Spain, they will say porros in plural. But the rebranding of the word marijuana, I think, has been especially, has had a big effect in our culture, right? There was a lot of stigma associated to the word marijuana. And the rebranding as cannabis certainly had a very positive effect in the public's perception of what the plant did and it was and what it could do in terms of its health benefits. But I think it really varies. The way, for instance, I decide which word to use depends a lot on what the content is about, right? And how people are searching for it. You also gotta be a little bit strategic there, right? If you're producing content with the intent to educate, you got to speak to the audience that is looking for it, because otherwise you can produce the best content in the world, but if people don't know about it, can't find it, it won't have an impact. It's the same as having a company, right? If people, you can have the best technology in the world in 𝗏𝗏𝐺𝐻, but if people don't know about it, you'll be bankrupt in 2 years, right? And it's sometimes that kind of decision, but again, I think it's an ongoing debate. Some people think it's a forbidden word, other people think it's interchangeable, and I don't know really what the conclusion or the definitive response could be.
Right. Right.
Javier, I want to ask you, you started El Planteo to serve Spanish-speaking people who are interested in cannabis and mota, but I want to share a little bit with our listeners about what's going on in Latin America in terms of cannabis business opportunities. That's tends to be what we talk about here.
And your co-host, your co-host wants to know too.
Yeah, like we're really interested in what's going on down there that are real business opportunities. So I'd love to get your take on it.
It's very fragmented, right? It's similar to the US in the sense that, like each state in the US has its own regulations and its own set of opportunities. It's very similar in Latin America. The only, footnote that I would make is we don't have any markets that are as developed as the US markets. If we start at the top, Puerto Rico, which is a part of the US, even though it's a little bit more complex in terms of the situation that they have legally. There's a big market there, right? There's, I think, over $200 million in annual sales, but it's medical only. But they have dispensaries, they have brands. I've seen some products, I think, with 𝗏𝗏𝐺𝐻 technology in them, right? So that is a very interesting market. There is, for instance, one company that is selling $50-60 million in medical cannabis a year. So it's not negligible. But then the rest of Latin America is a little bit more complex. Definitely, as I mentioned, fragmented. People were very excited about Mexico. Mexico is not a market that has opened up yet. People expected it to go rec. It hasn't gone rec yet. Colombia held a lot of promise, in the first few years following, the legalization of and regulation of medical cannabis production in 2017. About $1 billion in foreign capital, especially Canadian, but also US and from other places came in, but the industry didn't develop as fast. Regulations didn't fully accompany the investment. So a lot of people invested a lot of money, and then were left holding a lot of product that they couldn't sell because they couldn't sell flower domestically in Colombia. They could only make topicals or compound formulations. I don't know what you call them, and it's like compound pharmacy. Everyone was betting on the export market. The export market wasn't regulated in Colombia, and then even when it did get regulated, there aren't international regulations and treaties that will allow for a seamless trade of cannabis internationally, right? You have to go unilaterally, one by one. And the demand isn't there, right? A lot of people now are hoping that Germany will be a big buyer. But if you look at German regulations, the medical market is pretty much supplied, and the adult use market will only allow for local production. So like a lot of people, I meet a lot of people, a few months ago in Argentina, the Inter-American Development Bank hosted this event, and they asked me to be there as a mentor for some Argentine projects. And many of them were talking about, their plans and building a business to export. And I had to give them this sobering and somewhat downer dose of reality that was like, there isn't an export market, right? Mm-hmm. Uruguay, which was the first country to legalize adult use cannabis, didn't do it at first with a spirit of commercialization or to drive an industry, but rather to just stop people from going to prison for it. So same thing, the industry didn't develop locally. They bet, as the industry grew, they were betting on exports. Exports were very slow. There's a small demand from Switzerland, maybe a small demand from Israel or Australia sometimes, but the market isn't really there as much. It's and it's very medical. If you look at a country like Argentina, which is probably the highest interest country in terms of the interest that the population has for cannabis and the acceptance, cultural acceptance of cannabis. But the market is very medical, right? There is home growing and nonprofit organizations providing patients, and there are some commercial licenses, but no path to selling the product, right? So I think the spirit of Latin America for the most part was focused on serving patients, right? It was patient advocacy groups who drove legalization forward. So they didn't think of industries to drive profit, to make people rich. They just wanted to serve patients as soon as possible. The situation with Colombia was different, but again, the promises didn't fully materialize. So the question of where is Latin America really varies from country to country. Chile has a little bit more stringent regulations to access cannabis, but at the same time, a very big market where people consume a lot of paraphernalia and of course they love cannabis as well. So it's a fragmented market, but I think it will be developing in the next few years, especially as governments realize that beyond serving the patients, which was something that they did originally because it politically looked good to help a child with epilepsy. Now they're also realizing, okay, we have tight budgets, and if we regulate this, we can generate tax income, we can attract foreign investment, right? And they're slowly getting there, but it's always same as rescheduling, right? It's a Rachel and Ross at Friends kind of situation. It's like, will or won't they? Forever.
Yeah. I mean, there was a lot of excitement when Mexico started moving towards legalization. Is there an indication of when that might actually come to fruition?
No, not really.
No.
I mean, it's
Just
predicting political
holding
processes is like, yeah, I am anti-crystal ball in that sense, because predicting political processes is almost a futile exercise. It's good to think about it. It's good to do analysis, but ultimately it's very unpredictable. Things change every day, right? Political interest and pressures change every day. And what goes on behind closed doors in terms of negotiations tends to be a lot more complex than we think, right? Like even when ideologically a lawmaker might support legalization, they will want something in exchange, from the person pushing that project forward, right?
Yeah.
And you will see that it's like, okay, but this law should also include an incentive for the production of citrix or of coal or this or that, right? So what will happen in Mexico is an unknown. There seems to be a lot of political support and public support for adult use legalization, but if you follow the headlines throughout the last 4 years or so, there's always been a headline every 3 months saying Mexico on the brink of legalizing, and then they don't.
And you talked about criminalization and how I think you said it was Uruguay that really created regulations that were more about keeping people out of jail than creating an industry. And in the U.S., we've seen that legalization and policy change has often started in the social justice movements, and then as the industry has grown and developed and regulations have unfolded, there's been sometimes like a splitting off of incentives and alignments of that no longer is the social justice movement as aligned with kind of the corporate interests, and it comes in and out. There tends to be this sort of roller coaster of sometimes they're aligned and working together and sometimes they're not, and by and large I think there's a general agreement that many of the social equity programs in the US have not been successful or lived up to the hopes and dreams of many of the participants, because the industry has been so hard and so tough and capital has been constrained and things like that. I'm curious, since you brought up criminalization in Latin America, uh, if there is a social justice, social equity type parallel that's happening as part of the conversation, and how you see that potentially being a part of the forward progress or not.
It's interesting, right? I think there's a tension. Right? Let's start with the U.S. Right? I think there's a tension with the American ethos of free enterprise, of the land of opportunity and financial development, and the real promise of legalization. Right? The legalization movements, always wanted people to get out of jail and stop going to prison for it, people to be able to access medicine. It was never part of the premise to make people rich, right? And now you do hear a lot of people saying, it's not fair. The rules don't allow us to make enough money. But that was never a promise, right? Like the reality behind the push for legalization was to drive social justice. It is true that social equity programs in the US have failed in many cases, in the sense that they haven't provided enough opportunities, financial opportunities, for those most affected by the war on drugs. But we've seen expungement. We've seen people get out of prison, which is something that hasn't really happened massively in Latin America, right? People are still in prison. People are still going to prison. Even in Uruguay, where they have an adult use program. Last year, a lot of growers went to prison because they were, the same thing. They had this issue where they were running clubs, and clubs have a limited number of members, so they weren't making enough money, but they were growing more weed than they could dispense. So then they were turning with that weed to the illicit market, and the government did an investigation, and they all ended up in prison, right? What they were doing was outside the regulations that they themselves had asked for. They had asked the government to give them a clear set of rules of how they could do business in the cannabis space. We could debate forever. I think that should be fine. It shouldn't be, something that lands you in prison, right? But there's always this tension, right, where economic opportunities need to coexist with the movement that pushes social justice and patient access, right? To me, that is the priority, right?
Mm-hmm.
Making money off weed is totally secondary in that sense. But I don't think we have such a strong social equity movement in Latin America like we've seen in the US. Also because the consequences of the war on drugs were different. Even though they emanated from the US and they had a huge impact on Latin America, the situation is different. So there is, to a certain level, inclusion, for instance, of indigenous peoples in the industry, but they don't get the resources, right? There aren't social equity programs to support the massive investment that is required to participate in the cannabis industry. I don't know. It's like all the questions you ask me, it's like I feel like I'm just going in circles. It's like I don't have a definitive answer, right?
Yeah.
Like all of these processes are so complex, and there's so many different interests at play, that there's never a straightforward answer to whether things are working, things are progressing, something will happen. What's the right word?
Many
it's all a
things
matter
can
of
be true at the
perspective.
same time.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's almost reassuring to me as a business owner in the US, because I have a lot of FOMO when I start thinking about other markets and my lack of attention on them. And so if I can just put LATAM back in a box for a little bit and continue to focus my efforts on the unpredictable and politicized and tough to make money market of the US, then happy to
There's
absorb
still
that.
a lot of work to be done, right? There's an expression in Argentina that goes el que mucho abarca poco aprieta, which loosely translates to this is not a hug, right? So in order to get a grip on the US market, you got to be focused, right? You got to be able to grip, right? If you're trying to grab a lot, then you won't get a grip on anything. I think it's gradual. At the same time, as we were discussing earlier, the technology that Vertosa has that advantage of being able to move across borders much more easily than product containing flower or extracts or whatever. So,
Right. Yeah.
Well, so
Yeah.
jumping into US, let's talk about your work in Benzinga. You've got all these hats, you know, and a lot of people know of Benzinga as a media outlet, but it's also an events company. I'd love to hear a little bit about what you guys all have in store for us in Chicago with the upcoming event. And yeah, what's the plan? What are we all doing in a month or so?
So as you mentioned, Benzinga is a media company based out of Detroit, representing the 313. Big fan of Detroit, my favorite American city, I'm going to say. But as you mentioned, we also do events, we do, technology products, and I think our beyond the fact that Benzinga Cannabis, so our cannabis vertical, is the most read cannabis news source in the world, and gets distributed through MSM, Bloomberg, Robinhood, Fidelity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think a large part of our success stemmed from our events, right? We've done more than 20 conferences now in the cannabis space, focused on business and finance and investing and marketing. But I think that at the core of these events is the networking aspect, right? People come for the speakers, but stay for the connections, right? And I've seen that increasingly, right? We can announce the best keynote speaker in the world, and people will buy tickets for that, but then they will return, even if that keynote speaker is not there anymore, because they find that it's a curated environment where they can connect with like-minded people, where they can connect with other businesses in the space, where they find investors. We usually have between 200 and 600 active investors at our conferences. So people, raise money. We've gotten calls, from large MSOs saying, "Hey, we closed a $2.5 billion deal at your conference because we just met this other company."
Wow.
A friend of mine will text me on WhatsApp the day after the conference or a week after, saying, "Hey, I just raised $10 million. I met this guy, while at the cocktail hour or the after party or during the networking session." Right. So it is an interesting mix of education, general debate, and networking that I think takes place there.
It is tough to, in the world of where MJ Biz was kind of the lighthouse event for everyone. It was tough to kind of launch a new conference series and really differentiate. And AnnaRae and I were both at Benzinga in Miami, and we're just kind of thrilled with the quality of the speakers and the attendees, and to your point, just the networking was insane. And do you think that was the investor network that drew that curation together? Because I don't feel like it's not like you're applying to go, so it's not heavily guarded from a curation standpoint, but it does seem to attract a lot of the influential people at these different companies.
So it's a few things, right, Ed? Hats off to MJ Biz for everything they built. I think it's a fantastic event. It's the type of event that you saw in around the world, right? If you go to Spain, you got Cannabis. If you go to Argentina, you got the Expo Cannabis. You got the Expo Cannabis in Uruguay and Chile. Every country has their major B2C kind of event, right? Where you got a huge expo hall and you get a lot of people in the business, and then just people who are curious about the business or the industry or the plan, or just want to go see paraphernalia or meet one of the people who will be showing up there. I think the Benzinga value prop, I think, was kind of a self-fulfilled prophecy, right? The fact that we chose to curate our content and our agenda and the topics that are discussed in the panels in a certain way automatically created the kind of audience that was attending, right?
Mhm.
If you look at the agenda, it's the kind of topic that makes you think, oh, I got to wear a suit and tie for this, right? It's a lot of investing and finance and policy and ways to market your product. So I think the topics built the audience, and then the audience, kind of dictated the direction of the evolution of the topics that we're touching on.
The event's a great size. Like, that's the other thing for me. Like, a lot of my business is built on building trusting relationships with people that then are like, oh, okay, you're smart. You could help us come solve this problem. And it's harder to do when you're at a place like MJ Biz that just has so many people.
Mhm.
And you know, in the corner of large events, you end up making those connections. It happens, but Benzinga is just a more manageable size where you can make the rounds, have the important conversations. And yeah, I have been there both as an operator and representing investors, and I've met people, from both perspectives that have helped move things forward for me. So I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's going to be fun.
Well, the big difference
Thank
is
you.
the big difference is that at MJ Biz, a lot of stuff happens outside the conference.
That's true.
And then what I remember from Benzinga is like everything's happening inside the conference. Like everyone's going.
It's in the hotel lobby. Well, it's a crowd like 2,000, 2,500 people. You can fit in the hotel lobby, right? At an event that has 30,000 people, it's hard to nail people down, right? And find them. But the other thing that I would say is, I think part of the success of Benzinga conferences came from the development of personal relationships, right? All these CEOs and investors were people that we had interviewed that they knew our work. So when we reached out, they were willing to show up to speak, right? And that then attracted the many other attendees, right? But I think it's also part of why then the relationship making component is such a big part of the Benzinga events, right? Because people are there because of relationships, then relationships take the center stage as the event takes place, right?
Does
Vegas
the
is a fun week though.
does the journalist in you like to try to predict what the major topics of conversation are going to be like in the audience? Because I came away from, and this somewhat resonates with the content that's on stage, but it's a little different. Like coming away, I'm like, oh wow, like beverage was holding about 50% of the oxygen in the room. There was definitely a lot of conversations about like what's happening in Europe. What maybe has changed in the last 6 months? What do you think like the meaty conversations are going to be circling around the conference in October?
Well, definitely rescheduling and the election. I think that is like the main topic. Then Ohio is pretty hot. Is what I'm seeing a lot. Of course, like the challenges of raising capital are always at the center of the conversation. And then the one that is really, the two newer conversations, of course, because rescheduling and the election, are new, but they're policy, right? And they're reforms. So it's an old topic with a new name. But the rise of the beverage conversation and the hemp-derived cannabinoids and the intoxicating, if you will, side of hemp-derived cannabinoids are two topics that are really taking the center stage in the conversations. I think beverages are just becoming a huge topic, a little bit on the back of the proliferation of hemp-derived cannabinoids, just because suddenly they're available at every other gas station and bodega. But also because there's such an ease and convenience in consumption, right? It's at least I feel it's the next step for normalization and mainstreaming of cannabis, right? As a not so much as a medical substance, even though as well, but also as a recreational substance.
Yeah.
Because that is what we're used to, right? When I first tried, and like, this is not a specific shout out, but like just my experience, when I first tried the Saka wine, I think it was 2017, I was in Vegas, and someone came out with a case of that, and they were like, hey, you got to try this. You're Argentine, you know wine, you got to try
Yeah.
this. It's not true. And I was like, oh my God, this is insane, because when you get together with friends and family or whatever, there's a very clear tradition and predisposition in people to share a drink. You want to toast, you want to have something that's familiar, and cannabis beverages are very much fitting that kind of tradition and situation, generally socially. Also, smoking is not as friendly to people around you, and suddenly you have a nice beverage, and it's familiar.
Yeah.
It breaks that stigma, and of course, all the general discourse of the beverage space in cannabis revolves a lot around, like, hey, there's no hangover, which
Hmm.
honestly, as you age, you realize is a real concern.
Yeah. Yeah. Shout out to Cynthia and
Sure.
Tracy. I still have like some of the old bottles. It was so beautiful. I just love the brand. Just too early. The regulated California market was so tough.
Mhm.
There wasn't enough room for like kind of nuanced products at the time. And
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, but then there's a lot of them that have like massive success. Of course, like Can always comes to mind, but like
Mhm.
again, the same thing is with the advent of hard seltzers. Suddenly, everyone was looking for some kind of seltzer
Yeah.
because they taste good, they're easy to drink. Um, and honestly, if you ask me if I would choose one with vodka or one with THC, probably I would go with the THC one.
Yeah. Well, we
I
love
love
hearing that.
Well, so there, since you are someone that really is up on the news, it seems like we should touch on a few things that have come up in this last week. Something that was pretty disappointing to some to hear was the announcement about the rescheduling
Yeah, like the
hearing
retail investors.
happening in December. So pushing the rescheduling conversation to after the election. Uh, what do we think here, everyone? How predictable was this? It was pretty
I
predictable,
was
right?
going to ask you that.
I know.
Actually, it's disappointing. Is it surprising?
I would not say it's surprising. We've talked about Chevron on this podcast. My business partner actually came on and talked to us about Chevron, and I think that the fact that the agencies want to cover their ass means that this is the type of work that's going to be undertaken in order for policy change to come from an agency. They want to really dot all their I's and cross all their T's and investigate all of both the comments, the complaints, and the scientific support for rescheduling. But I think the
What's
downside to that, though, is that, like, depending on who wins the next presidential election, it could actually change the whole trajectory of the priority of this work.
what's surprising about it is just how people are reacting from like the promise of a potential rescheduling. People are buying stock of publicly traded companies, which what really is the positive impact besides maybe more capital coming into the space, but is that really going to impact the trajectory of an MSO right now? And then
Probably. There's a debate, right? Like, some MSOs will tell you federal legalization or rescheduling is not the best scenario for them. Most of them will tell you the opposite, of course. But the nature of the stock market isn't, to a certain extent, also speculative, right? So of course, when
right.
you get good news, you're going to try and buy as fast as possible. When you get bad news, anticipating that the market will move that way, it's again a self-fulfilled prophecy in many cases, right? It's not like valuations are, like, the change in valuation does not reflect a change in fundamentals and how the companies are
Right.
doing, right?
Well, just looking at our industry's main ETF, MSOS, and its stock performance, I mean, it dropped over 10%, maybe like 15% on this announcement 2 days ago, and it's recovered.
Yeah, but it's not like
bit.
rescheduling's done. It's just
No.
it's delayed, like all political processes are these days. And so it's
And
not a
there was no
Here's the
promise
flip
anyway.
side.
Yeah, it makes no sense, like the way these
People
stocks.
hate on me for saying this, but I'm going to say it. We got to be mindful of the timing of every political process, right? We think cannabis regulation and reform isn't moving as fast as we'd like to. And that is fair to say. I would like to see it done tomorrow, especially in the US where there's not even like medical legalization, or people are dying because they can't access cannabis. But in reality, it's a movement that is progressing faster than any other movement in the world. In the last 5 years, 70 countries moved to regulate cannabis in some way, shape, or form. How many US states regulated cannabis, even for adult use? 5 years ago, you wouldn't find a dispensary in most states, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the process is complex. I understand the DEA's reluctance, to going like, oh yeah, let's change our position overnight. It also doesn't look great because it's kind of a signal saying like, hey, we haven't really been reviewing the actual scientific evidence, but now that everyone is putting pressure on us, actually, the scientific evidence backs this. And there is a lot of scientific evidence to legalize cannabis. I am very much pro legalization. But I do understand that there are also other factors to look at. And, there are risks, there are implicit risks. If you ask me, rescheduling is a no-brainer. It's not legalization, right? It's not even decriminalization. It's just saying at this point in time, the potential for abuse of cannabis has been largely studied. And it is not comparable to what is in Schedule 1. It is not heroin. And it does have some accepted medical benefits. It is no longer anecdotal. The FDA has approved a cannabis-based medication for certain forms of epilepsy.
Mm-hmm.
So aren't we in agreement that if a substance has undergone 3-phased, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trials, and it has proven to be safe and effective, isn't that like an acceptable medical use?
Yeah.
Right. But I understand the need for this process to be gradual, and I understand why the DEA, which is also politically driven, might want to wait till after the election, right? Because the decision they make might be seen as right or wrong depending on who wins the election, right? No one wants to lose their job over this. I urge them to take action, but it's complex.
Well, so that's a topic that's kind of front and center for everyone, been top of mind for the entire year. You have a strong pulse on everything. Like, what's a story or narrative that you don't think is getting enough attention or enough play right now? Like, what should people be paying attention to as far as what really affects kind of the underpinnings of business right now?
That's a great question. What story affects? It's really, yeah, I don't know what could drive business right now. I think, most of it relates to adoption. When we saw the estimates for legal markets, whether it was Canada or a certain US state or whatever, for years we assumed adoption and the conversion from the illicit market to the legal market would be pretty instantaneous. And that was not the case, of course. But all of these stories that we're talking about clearly will define how business will be made and how businesses will succeed in coming years. Whether it's rescheduling, any of the safe banking, more hope, all these different projects being discussed in Congress. But ultimately, and this is kind of against much of the work that I do, in a sense, is I think the priority should be patients. If people are getting rich or not with cannabis, it's not a personal priority of mine.
Yeah.
I would love to see people thrive in the cannabis space. I think we deserve it. Many of us have been, chastised and prosecuted for cannabis use for many years, for cannabis advocacy for many years. But it's not my number one priority. Until we don't have a federal medical cannabis law in America, I really don't care if people are making that much money, right? Why aren't we united behind the number one thing that should matter here is like people not suffering because they can't access cannabis legally? Why are we not rallying behind the cause of letting people out of prison for nonviolent cannabis offenses? People are spending 40 years in prison. Once we've solved this, then we can discuss business. On the other hand, it is the business aspect of it that drives political change in America, especially because, as we all know, money talks. And if there is a great way to sway political opinion is showing them the money, even more so than a heartfelt story about a patient suffering from MS and suddenly seeing their seizures reduced by 95% overnight.
Yeah. You just pulled together so many conversations that I've been having, and it's just that we have infighting happening at many different levels right now. And a lot of us, talk the talk of being about the patients, creating access to the plant and getting people out of prison. But the actions people are taking, and it's happening in the hemp versus cannabis conversation. And it's happening just in the cannabis world in California. Like I saw an article today where the retailers are lobbying to prevent the farmers market kind of model from happening and allowing farmers to sell directly to patients. And I'm like, this is absurd. Like, have we become so myopic in our revenue generation that we are willing to put barriers in between the plant and the patient?
Exactly. And that is why I commend Argentina, for instance, for how they regulated cannabis, because the first thing they did when they came out with regulations was regulate home growing and a patient registry and a caregiver model. It wasn't driven by profit. It wasn't thought out to create millionaires. It was thought out first and foremost to deliver medicine to patients as soon as possible. That meant within 3 months, you could have your first legal harvest at home without fear of going to prison for growing that cannabis that you needed so desperately. Then they came out with regulations for the industry, for hemp, for commercial licenses. They will at some point regulate how that will be sold for commercial gain. But for now, it is a patient-driven market. And I love that. And of course, people will complain that there aren't generating enough financial opportunities. But we prioritized what was urgent and what was behind the discourse that drove legalization in most of these places. That was, people shouldn't be in prison. People shouldn't be suffering. They should be able to access their medicine. Okay, perfect. We delivered on that demand. Now you have access. Okay, what comes next? Let's develop an industry. Lovely. Let's make money. We all love money, but it's the next step, right? America kind of went the other way around. Let's first make money and then figure out how to best serve the patients.
Great points, and really, really interesting debate about the way that capitalism and greed kind of both supports and gets in the way of patient access and social justice. So thank you for
and I will say, sorry, one last thing, because on the other hand, like for instance, I said earlier, to a certain extent, investing in the stock market, in the capital markets is speculative. But at the same time, I'm a firm believer that investing in cannabis companies and biotech companies working with cannabinoids is investing in the future of medicine that can change the world, right? So if you're going to put your money to work, at least support something good. You can choose easily to invest your money in coal and oil drilling and see predictable dividends and nice returns and whatever. But if people who invested early in GW Pharmaceuticals, you ultimately were retail investors who ended up supporting the development of the first FDA and EU approved cannabis-based medication, right? So I think there's something to be said about that side as well, right? Those risking capital.
Yeah, sure. Well, we're at the end of our hour, and so this is our time when we turn the mic actually back over to you, Javier, for your last call to make your lasting impression on our audience, your call to action, whatever you like. So the mic is yours. What is your last call?
I'm going to repeat: support patient access, advocate for medical cannabis. Talk to your policymakers, local politicians, ask them to support legalization. Remember that people are still in prison for these plans. And that there's still opportunities and ways to do well by doing good. And this is an industry that at the same time allows us to do well by doing good. We're getting together to discuss how to do well by doing good, how to drive this movement forward, how to drive legalization at the Benzinga Cannabis Capital Conference, October 8 and 9 in Chicago, bzcannabis.com for more info. If you speak Spanish, check out planteo.com. And if not, benzinga.com/cannabis. It's we got all the news.
Amazing. I love all that. Thank you, Javier. Really, again, appreciate you taking the time to be with us. How best for people to follow you personally?
It's down there.
Oh, it's down there. At Javier Hasse.
If you're interested, reach out. Happy to help however I can. Ultimately, thank you for having me. I don't know. I got very talkative today.
It's great. That's why we had you on.
Great. Yeah, thank you.
But yeah, looking forward to seeing you in Chicago. A little bit over a month away.
So,
yeah, some in-person
good luck with all that.
on the way.
All right.
Ben, thank you.
Awesome. All right, AnnaRae, another one in the bag. It was great show. It's so cool to be able to interview someone that has been so present, I guess, in just building out our visibility in the cannabis world. I can't tell you how many articles I read of Javier's. I have the How to Start a Cannabis Business book on my bookshelf behind me. Got a little bit of a shout out in it. That was nice. Anyways, excited to see everyone at Benzinga in Chicago in a little over a month. It seems like the conference has really become a mainstay in the business world.
Absolutely. Well, let's read it out and we'll see everybody there.
Yeah, we will see you all there. And thank you for coming and seeing us here. Thank you for continuing to share, like, and subscribe. The guests we have lined up all the way through October at this point. Going to continue to give you the perspective of what's happening in Canada's world from different states, different corners of the industry. Really excited to dive into all that. So thank you to our teams at Wolf Meyer and Vertosa. Without you guys, we couldn't be doing this. So thank you for keeping our mics and lights on week after week after week. And remember, folks, stay curious, stay informed, and keep your spirits high. Until next time, that's the show.